Today I am here to talk to you about something important, something that I feel is not talked about nearly enough. Today I am going to talk to you about mental illness, about depression, about suicide, and most importantly, about surviving. One of the first things to know about mental illness and suicide is that age, race, gender, sexual preference, financial status, marital status, and so on and so forth are not a factor. Mental illness and suicide do not discriminate. Young or old, rich or poor, everyone is at risk. I've read several stories about children under the age of 10 dying by suicide, and I have read stories about people well into their 90s dying by suicide. When it comes to me, my first memory of wishing my life would end occurred when I was only in the 3rd grade. It's likely that I had never heard the word suicide, let alone knew what it meant. There was just a feeling in my mind that rather than being alive, I would prefer to not exist. I remember going so far as to pick out the outfit I wanted my parents to put me in for my own funeral. I am wearing that same outfit in my yearbook picture. Beginning in 5th grade, I started to have health issues. My pulse would race, my chest would hurt, and I would have trouble breathing. I would lose the color in my face, and my lips would turn blue. I literally felt like I was dying. I saw multiple doctors, ended up in the emergency room several times, underwent many tests, and even had to wear a heart monitor for a few months. Something was wrong with my heart, but nobody seemed to know what. During all of this time, I had finished elementary school and had gone on to junior high. I was an honor student and finished most trimesters with all A's. I actively participated in both volleyball and basketball and even did some volunteer work. I didn't have many friends, but I was happy with the ones I did. I was what I consider to be a fairly typical kid during these years. Just as I was entering my freshman year of high school, I finally received a diagnosis for my health troubles: anxiety. It was then that my primary care doctor prescribed me a medication to take that doubled both as an antidepressant and as an anti-anxiety. I started taking it just as I was told, once a day, every day. It made me feel different, but not in a good way. I felt zoned out. Things I cared about, such as academics, sports, and my social life, no longer meant much of anything to me. I attended high school without putting effort into it. I stopped playing sports. I lost almost all of my friends. Even my teachers noticed, which I only found out when I was anonymously referred to the substance abuse counselor at my school, who said several faculty members were concerned about my recreational drug use. Talk about confused, because honestly, I would not have known the difference between catnip, oregano, or marijuana. But here I was, being secretly labeled as some type of stoner kid in high school. So I did what I thought was best. I quit my medication, cold turkey, without consulting either my parents or my doctor. Nobody had informed me that doing so was a terrible idea, that weaning yourself off of medication or even without consulting your doctor about it can actually cause the symptoms you were feeling prior to the start of the medication to intensify and be several times worse than what they initially were. I was also unaware that if one medication was not working, there were others. I was under the impression that if it didn't work, it just didn't work. The truth is that each medication is different. What works for one person may not work for someone else with the same diagnosis. But because this was turned into such a taboo subject, people did not discuss these types of things. So I was left to figure it out on my own. Of course, being 14, I thought I knew everything already, so asking questions about this never crossed my mind, apparently. So as I was saying, when you quit these medications the way I did, what you can feel is usually worse than before. This is the point in my story where I attempt suicide for the first time. This is the point in my story where, for the first time in my life, I scoured the kitchen, found some whiskey, and chased it with a bottle of painkillers. Imagine now that you're an adult, a parent, and your child is in the back room, diddling around the computer. You've been at work all day, and now you're sitting in the peace and quiet of your own home, reading the newspaper, relaxing. Then suddenly, an urgent knock at the door comes and interrupts your night. Standing there on the darkened porch is a police officer who tells you that your teenage daughter, who has been sitting quietly in the back room, has possibly attempted suicide. You see an ambulance parked at the end of the driveway, and your heart is racing as you and the officer sprint through the house to the back bedroom, where you see your daughter dazed with her arms cut open. If you can imagine that in any way, you'll know how my dad felt that night, at least in some manner. Talk about taking someone's world and turning it upside down. Though I suppose perhaps it was better than some other alternative, such as him finding me in that state, or worse, on his own. Thankfully, a friend of mine had become concerned with something I had said earlier, and after being unable to reach me, called 911. Between the ages of 14 through 17, I would attempt suicide multiple times. 2 of those times I would panic once I started to feel drowsy and sick, and I would tell a friend who would take me to the hospital, who would then notify my parents. During this period, I also began to excessively self-harm. When my main tool was a razor, I'd also put out cigarettes on myself, punch walls until my knuckles ached and bled, and hold the flame from lighters to my skin for a minute or 2 at a time. Once, after a fight with a boyfriend, I even cut the word love into my own arm, leaving it to bleed for hours. While many think of this as a sign of a suicide attempt, the truth is that it becomes its own sort of disease. A psychiatrist once diagnosed me with self-injurious behavior syndrome, though I can't honestly tell you whether or not that's an actual thing. She said that I became addicted, in a sense, to hurting myself. I would do it when I was sad or upset, as most can imagine, but I'd also do it when I was happy, when I was bored, when I was excited, and basically whenever. During all of this time, I lost almost all of my friends. I remember trying to confide in one girl who I had considered at the time to be my best friend. She got mad at me for telling her my diagnosis. She told me that I had a social life, had been in sports, was smart, and did well in school. My parents were still married, I came from a big family, and so on. She told me that I needed to just get over it, and she didn't know what I had to be depressed about, but the truth was, neither did I. Eventually, my depression interfered even more with my life. I stopped attending school regularly. When I did show up, I once had a teacher yell at me for milking my diagnosis. According to her, there were people in school far more depressed than I was who still showed up for class. Shortly after this, I allowed myself to become isolated. I lost confidence in who I was. I stopped enjoying the things I used to. I stopped talking to friends. When I met a boy a few years older than me, I ran off with him and broke contact with my own family. Hating myself in the way that I did, I lost all self-esteem I had ever had. I began a relationship with a guy who, to say the least, was no gentleman. We were on and off for 2 years, first living in an abandoned house and then getting our own studio apartment. He was unfaithful to me, spent the money he earned for our rent on bills and drugs, and was abusive in all ways possible, and I allowed it. By this point in my life, I felt I had nothing left to lose and nothing left to gain. I dropped out of school, I worked full-time for only $6 an hour, and I lost all sight of all the goals and ambitions I had previously had. Towards the end of our relationship, the boyfriend I thought I loved started doing methamphetamine. About the same time, I found out I was pregnant. As you can imagine, the tension in our apartment was high, and our relationship became all the more toxic. He demanded I get an abortion, and while it's not my place to judge others for their own decisions, I did not feel that it was the right decision for me. I wanted to leave for the first time and not come back. I felt that I finally had a reason to my life, and I made a plan in my head to leave once I began showing, and never see him again. When he would leave for work, I would get into my hidden stack of prenatal vitamins and take one, each day. While he was asleep, I would sit on the back porch and come up with baby names. I loved my baby, and for a short while I felt a glimmer of hope. That glimmer of hope was short-lived. After a particularly bad fight, sparked over the controversial abortion I was refusing to have, I woke up the next morning, sore and bleeding. I learned only 2 days later that I had lost the pregnancy. Lost and more confused and hurt than ever, I had given up on my plan to leave. My depression worsened, and I felt that this was the life I deserved. Only a couple of days later, I would attempt suicide for the last and final time. Determined to do it this time, I pushed my limits further than I had in the past. I took a syringe, filled it with a flammable liquid, and injected it into my veins. The pain I felt was intense, to put it mildly. The nerves and tissue and muscle in my arm were literally corroding and dying from the outside in. Seeing what I had done, my boyfriend took away my car keys, told me this was my own problem, and took off in my vehicle, leaving me alone in a town almost half an hour from the nearest hospital. I would eventually find a way to the emergency room when that same boyfriend became concerned that he could potentially get in trouble for leaving me if I were dying. While he spoke to the hospital staff, I tried to run out a side door, where I was eventually tackled by a nurse. After 3 surgeons told me that my best option was an amputation of that arm before the liquid could travel to my heart and corrode it, one told me that he wanted to try flushing it, and then removing all of the damaged tissues, not sure whether or not I could keep the arm, or whether or not I'd ever regain full use if I did. 4 surgeries in 7 days, and I was lucky enough to keep my arm, and over the matter of a few months, I would be able to use it as normal, though the area surrounding the insertion point remains numb to this day. In past times, after an attempt, I would wind up in the intensive care unit, be put on a 24-hour suicide watch, and then released. Perhaps that sounds nonsensical, but the reality is that mental health is often underfunded and psychiatric units often overfilled. But due to the severity of this attempt and my past history, room was made. I would spend almost 6 months in the locked ward wing of a mental health facility. In time, I would be released back to my parents' house. I would be prescribed medication and forced to attend therapy. While all of this was a step in the right direction, I was still depressed and did not utilize the resources around me. I took the medication and I attended expensive therapy sessions where I refused to talk because I was told to. Depression is like a cancer of the mind. It gets in there, it settles down, and it spreads. If we catch it, there are ways to treat it, to slow it down, to make it tolerable. People can live with depression. If we don't get to it in time, it can be fatal. The idea of suicide can become a disease. Once someone's mind becomes seduced by the thought, it grows like an infection. A person can become consumed by the idea. It becomes a desire, but we are capable of coming back from that. We are capable of fighting it. One day I looked around and I saw the life that I was missing out on. I saw all of the opportunities missed, the special moments lost. I saw the happiness in others, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, I thought that perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I really did deserve that in my own life as well. It was then that I realized for the first time that I was actually really sick. I made the decision to fight for my life and for my happiness. I talked to my doctor and I started medication. I got therapy and I attended support groups. I made myself work on positive thinking. When it came to confidence, I went around faking it until I made it. Suddenly I could smile without having to force it. I could laugh freely. Best of all, I could feel again. It took some hard work, but I made it through the storm. Where I had once spent days in bed not bothering to so much as turn on the light, I now chase sunsets with my camera and I find joy in simple things that I used to overlook. I find myself trying to take full advantage of all the wonderful things that life has to offer. One of the biggest stigmas surrounding those suffering from a mental illness, such as depression, is that reaching out for help means that you're weak. But as we know, that's not true. In fact, I find it to be rather courageous to admit that you cannot always do it alone, and that sometimes you need the extra helping hand. We wish to appear strong and brave and capable. Reality is that we are only human, and therefore we are sometimes vulnerable and fragile. To admit that requires strength, and while it may sound difficult to some, once that barrier is passed, accepting the help becomes easier. Eventually I went on to get my GED and became an honor student in college. I met the love of my life, and together we had a beautiful son. We owned a home, he began his own business, and it really started to take off. In 2011 we became engaged after a romantic weekend getaway in New York. We started trying for our second child and stayed up late at night thinking up baby names. We started house hunting and after a few months found our new dream home. We planned our wedding down to the smallest details. Life was great, maybe even as close to perfect as it could be at the time. I still suffered through my anxiety and depression, but suicide had become a thing of the past. At least I thought it had. Until the morning of October 15th, 2011. That was the morning that I became a suicide survivor. My fiancé of 4 years, my best friend, and the father of my child took his own life. I had talked to him on the phone not even 10 minutes earlier, and while he sounded tired, there was no indication of what was about to happen. My life changed forever that morning. I remember watching the sun rise only an hour later. The sky was clear and blue, and the weather was perfect. I remember being angry that such a terrible thing could happen, and the earth would still provide such a beautiful day to follow. It made no sense to me, just as Bill's death did not make sense to me. When we grieve, we not only grieve over the loss of that person, but we grieve over what could have been, should have been, and would have been. Bill was a kind and wonderful person. He was loving and caring and just the type of guy everyone wants to be around. He loved life. He absolutely enjoyed it. People who aren't suicide survivors and who put trust into the stigma surrounding suicide may think that sounds absurd, that someone who dies this way could love life, but he truly did. I do not believe that Bill wished for his life to end or that he wanted to die. I believe he just wanted the pain to stop, and in that desperate time, the emotional and mental pain became too much to physically bear, and he no longer knew the difference between the two. One of the biggest stigmas surrounding suicide that I'd like to address is that there's either someone or something to blame. Maybe that person had a bad day at work. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe their relationship was on the rocks. Maybe they were feeling guilty over something. Maybe they had family issues. Maybe they had financial issues. Maybe they were fighting a substance abuse problem, and the list just goes on. But really, there is no place for blame. The person died because of a mental illness. The person died because they were sick. Perhaps there might have been a negative experience that triggered it, but the likelihood is that they've had these thoughts and feelings more than once before their passing. They've thought about it, they've planned it, and suddenly they chose to execute it. There are people living under the false assumption that by mentioning the word suicide to someone you are concerned over, they will be placing that idea in their head. I cannot express enough that this belief is false. Asking someone that tough question can be life-saving. Talking about suicide does not cause someone to become suicidal, but it may prevent it. It opens the door of communication. It shows that person that you are worried and that you care. It allows them to feel that they finally have someone to talk to. We need to not just leave this discussion to be hidden in the dark corners of our worlds. We need to bring it out into the light. Years before we'd even met, Bill had attempted suicide at least twice. The first time he purchased a firearm, and after not being able to figure it out, he tossed it into the river, returned home, and never spoke of the incident for nearly a decade. The second time was approximately 6 years after that, and he ended up in the hospital for several days after overdosing on prescription medication. These thoughts were with him since high school. While they may have disappeared for several years, they never were forgotten. I cannot say what happened during the few hours before Bill ended his life. We had a family dinner, and he was in a good mood. He left for work, returned home, and within minutes of walking in the door, he was dead. I would be told a few days later that during his final shift at work, the night before his death, Bill, who was a typically energetic and charismatic DJ, shut himself in the manager's office at work with the lights off and did not speak to anyone. This was not his normal behavior, and while several of his coworkers claimed to feel concern at the time, nobody knew to speak up and ask him what was bothering him, and nobody thought to call me and tell me of his unusual behavior. I spent many lonely nights wondering what would have happened if someone had said something. What would have happened if someone had warned me? Would I have known to have been as concerned as I needed to be? Would I have known to call 911 or remove the firearms from my house? Would I have known to be waiting by the door of our home with open arms, ready to ask the tough questions? In the months before Bill died, he often complained that he had nobody. He often stated that he had no friends, and other than myself had nobody to care about him. I always stated otherwise, and attempted to reassure him. I wish Bill could have been there to see the over 500 people that showed up to his funeral. I wish he could have seen the waiting line of all the people who had loved him and cared about him. I wish I could have seen his face when he saw how loved he really was. Depression has a way of making you feel alone, even in the midst of a crowd. It shadows the good, and reality can become blurred. I used to wonder why, a lot. I used to stay up into the wee hours of the morning, questioning everything. I thought of the what-ifs, the should-haves, the I-wishes. For the first few weeks, I would stay up late at night after my son was asleep, and I would fantasize about a world where Bill had not died. I allowed myself to believe that he was just working another late night. I imagined him on an out-of-town trip for business. I thought of how tight I would hug him when he finally returned home. I imagined how happy our son would be to see his daddy again. As we fell asleep in an empty bed each night, I pretended none of this had truly happened. But then each morning I would wake up in a house that was not mine, alone in a bed that did not belong to me, with my suitcase on the floor and my belongings scattered across the carpet. Reality would hit me, and I would once again fill my head with the question of why, what if, and I wish. The question of why gets us nowhere in our process of healing. Letting go of the question why does. We want to understand, and it's only normal for us to question everything, looking to pinpoint a single reason, and again, it all comes back to wanting to blame something or someone. What we must realize is that whatever answer we find will never be good enough, will never give us full understanding, and will likely just leave us asking more questions. We cannot change what has happened. We can only learn how to move forward and find a way to approach acceptance. I hear often of how suicide is thought to be an act of selfishness or cowardice. I have heard people refer to it as an easy way out, but I can tell you there is nothing easy about it. There is nothing selfish about it, and it takes more than a coward to consider it. What it takes to lead someone to the belief that suicide is an option goes above just pain and hurt. It is a war waging on the inside. It is a struggle full of hard, uphill battles. People suffering with depression can sometimes even feel physical pain as a symptom. Where there once was hope, all that can now be seen is despair. The fight becomes exhaustive, and while there are resources out there, even if we are aware of them, it often feels as though no matter what we do, how much therapy time we log, how much medication we are given, what we feel is too harsh to ever be remedied. I personally feel that the reason I avoided the help I knew I needed for those few years was because I felt that I did not deserve it. People do not attempt or succeed in suicide to be spiteful or hurtful. We do so because we are in search of relief. I came across a quote recently given by an unnamed Catholic priest at an AA Al-Anon retreat in Colorado who said, "Suicide is an act of hope. The soul who commits suicide cannot bear the place in which it finds itself and reaches out for something better." While I cannot speak on behalf of everyone who has been in such a place, I can tell you that I find that quote to be an almost perfect assessment of what I felt during those years in which to live was a difficult task. To end my life was the only way I believed I would finally find solace, but I thought not just of myself. I felt that by removing myself from this world, I would also be offering relief to my family and to my friends. No longer would they have to deal with me. I honestly felt that by taking myself out of the equation, I would be offering them a gift of my absence. I felt that the grief they would feel would be short-lived, and that they would be able to continue a life without me, as if I had never existed. No longer would they have to deal with my mood swings. No longer would they have to provide for me or pay my bills. No longer would I be there to burden them. I have very little doubt that what Bill felt during those last few moments that he was on Earth were similar. But now as a suicide survivor, I know that my feelings and thoughts were false, more so than I could have ever imagined. I have been alive for only 23 years, but the number of funerals and deaths that I have had to endure for loved ones exceeds the amount of years I have been breathing. I have felt grief on all levels, from losing a pregnancy of my own, seeing a friend lay their infant child to rest, to life ending after an unforeseen accident, to seeing my family members live past a century. From deaths we knew were going to happen, to those that brought us tragic surprise, I have experienced the sadness and loss, but the death that comes from a suicide is different. The grief we feel is different, and I feel that it cannot be justly described or understood by anyone other than those who have experienced it. During the first few weeks after Bill's funeral, many people would offer me their support by telling me that they could not imagine what I was feeling. While I thanked them, I usually responded in my head by saying I'm glad they couldn't, because I would wish it upon no one. There is a huge emphasis placed upon telling people in need of the resources that are here to help them. The suicide prevention hotline, emergency personnel, the primary care doctor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, support groups, and so on. But I believe to the full extent that we need to go above just that. We need to remind them that we love them, that we care about them. We need to tell them that we do not wish to live without them, that they have changed our lives, and that without them we would never be the same. So here I am, exactly 2 years and a few weeks after Bill's death, speaking out about suicide prevention and discussing the different resources that can be used to help aid someone struggling with mental health, and I plan on continuing to do so until my vocal cords shrivel up from exhaustion. I may not have been able to intervene and save Bill, but if telling my story again and again means that my words will either reach someone and prevent them from turning to suicide, or if they will reach someone who will be able to intervene and save someone else from suicide, then all of my pain and suffering will be worth it. It will all be worth it to know that I may potentially save someone from suffering through the same heartache and loss that plagues my own heart and the hearts of my fellow suicide survivors. It will be worth it knowing that I took Bill's tragic death and turned it into something positive by breaking the stigmas and raising awareness. Even all of these years later, I am still getting treated for my depression, because I know if I stop taking my medication, I am putting myself at risk for feeling sick again. But after seeing the devastation that Bill's suicide created, I make sure that I take care of myself, not just for me, not just for Bill, but for our son's sake. Because both of us battled depression, and because we both fought suicidal thoughts, our son is more likely to grow up fighting those same feelings. But unlike Bill and me, I want my son to know that to grow up knowing that there are resources, knowing the signs and symptoms, knowing that those stigmas are false, and knowing that he has a world of support behind him if it ever comes to that point. We are capable of surviving. By raising awareness, asking for help, sharing our stories, we are capable of helping others survive as well. I am hoping that what I have said here today will not just impact you for the time being or for the remainder of the day or week, but I hope that it will stay with you. I hope that it will give you the ability to talk about these things, to be open with others, and to speak up when you are concerned either for yourself or someone else. I hope this will encourage you to replace the silence with knowledge and support. I tell you my story today, both of losing Bill and of my own battle with depression, because I want you to know that I'm not just up here rambling. I want you to know that you are not alone, and someone is here, and someone has experienced what you have. I want you to see that I have made it. I am standing up here to show you that you can make it too. 90% of people who die by suicide have a treatable mental illness at the time of their death, but out of those, only 30% have received any type of mental health treatment during the last year of their life. Over 38,000 people die by suicide annually here in America, which is about one person every 13.7 minutes, 105 people each day, and is greater than the amount of people it would take to fill up Fenway Park Stadium. In 2010, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in our nation. Each year here in the United States, a greater number of people die by suicide than in car accidents. Approximately 8.3 million adults last year reported feeling suicidal thoughts. About 2.2 million reported making plans for their suicide in the past year, and it's estimated that about 1 million made a suicide attempt. For every suicide, there are 25 attempted suicides. And every 40 seconds, someone in this world dies by suicide, which means that every 41 seconds, someone in this world is left wondering why. Together, we can change this.